We're going to walk through several items here today in terms of AP processes and how WorldView can assist in creating efficiency within those processes. So to get started, just a quick rundown of what we'll talk through today. We'll start out with some items to consider. And what I mean by that is think about your processes today, the steps that are involved, the individuals involved, and how can we spark some ideas and look at how we can improve upon those processes. We'll also look at WorldView offerings from a benefit standpoint, some specific examples of AP automation that we provide and have put in place for some of our current partners. And then we'll walk through a few examples of those from a demo perspective and then wrap up with next steps. So to start, with items to consider, from a high-level overview, think about your current AP processes. So for example, AP invoice approvals, maybe certificates of insurance and how you manage those renewals, bringing on new vendors and that application and review process. Within these processes, are there email approvals involved, right? Things that may potentially cause a delay or maybe get missed. Do some of these processes require multiple reviews? Are there several individuals reviewing invoices or other items that could potentially create a bottleneck or hold up approval? Data entry, of course, that's a big question for everybody. Is there a lot of manual effort going on to enter data? And potentially, is that being done on multiple occasions? Or, as the next point says here, potentially working in various systems? Are you having to go back and forth? Are your teams having to go back and forth between systems to pull up documentation, review that information, and eventually complete their process? So in conjunction with those items, a few other items to think about. We look at processes as whether they're centralized or decentralized. So we work with a lot of partners who come to us and say, we have a decentralized process. Every branch, so to speak, approves their own invoices or has to do their own reviews on things, and then everything comes back to corporate office after that. So what we do is work with those folks who are looking for assistance in how to centralize that process and really make it more efficient. On the other hand, we also have partners who come to us that already have that centralized process in place. So everything is routed through their corporate office. They're able to get those items handled in one spot. However, their concern and their roadblock is they don't have a standard framework in place for these processes to make sure that everybody who's involved is performing those processes consistently. So this is something we certainly also assist with as well when considering solutions for your AP processes. Of course, some other things to consider as well from an invoice review and approval standpoint. We know that that is one of those business critical processes in every organization, ours included. Think about the efficiency within that process. How many people are involved? Do all of the steps in that process, do they add value? These are other things to think about. And then from an organizational growth standpoint, this is one that I especially like to discuss with our partners. Because really it's thinking about the long term for your company. We know the industry is kind of booming right now, and I've spoken with several peers recently in regard to that and saying, okay, as your volume is continuing to grow, as your organization is expanding, maybe bringing on other locations, acquiring other companies, what is your plan for your processes, right? Typically, the easy answer is we're going to hire more folks. We're gonna hire part-time or full-time employees, and that's a great solution. But from a long-term perspective, is that something that you want to have to continue doing? Right? Are you going to continue to add that as an additional cost? Whereas when we look at your process today, solutions that we might be able to put in place for you and create that efficiency, those are going to be things that scale as your volume grows, as your organization grows as well, where you're going to be able to rely on those solutions as opposed to having to add more staff and then more staff over time. One other thing to consider is when we're looking at these processes, of course, it's very common that there are roadblocks or frustrations from folks who are directly involved. A lot of these that are listed here are specific examples we've received and have ultimately been able to provide a solution for. So, if there's a situation where you're having to wait on an email response for someone to provide approval or at least just an answer on something, that certainly we know can take a long time. Misplaced documents, if you have a paper-based process or paper-based processes, this is something that easily can happen all of the time. And so then what are you going to do, right? You may have to reprint those documents, send them through the review process again. So that is a very common frustration we see. Handling exceptions. So there's going to be exceptions regardless of your process or what solution we can put in place. But are those being handled as efficiently as they can be, right? There may be frustrations with that, but how do we get over those frustrations as quickly as possible? We'll show a few examples of that. And then AP Recon, again, one of those things that everybody has to deal with within the organization, but can certainly be a frustrating venture depending on the scenario. That is going to be one of the main key points we hit on here later in the presentation, is how that can be done with automation and ultimately prevent that frustration that might exist today. And then lastly, really the main thing that we're looking at today is how can you gain an advantage over your competitors, again, in this booming market and pull more share there, but also realize a return on your investment. So as we go through these things, consider these items, and then of course, afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer any questions or follow up with you individually and talk through what we can do to help. So from an offerings perspective, I look at this as some benefits that WorldView can provide. First of all, of course, as you all know, we have the direct integration with Agility. We always want to take advantage of the APIs that they offer in order to export that data over to Agility. We'll speak about the voucher creation API shortly here. And one of the most common things that you'll hear today is complete oversight. So basically, any process that we evaluate and consult with our partners on, the ultimate goal is to provide that complete oversight, greater visibility, transparency into what is taking place at any step within the process. And then ultimately, like I mentioned, making sure there's a framework around any given process. That anyone involved understands what they're supposed to do and that everyone is doing that consistently. A couple of other benefits really quickly. As I mentioned, scalable platform. We utilize Highland OnBase and we've partnered with them for over 2 decades. And really one of the main reasons is the solution, the platform is able to grow, again, across an entire organization, solutions for any department, but also as things evolve and partners grow in size, these solutions are going to be scalable across that organization. And then from a WorldView standpoint as well, customizable solutions. So anything that we talk through with you, we're able to create based on your requirements. Our team will work with your team to make sure the specific requirements and anything that is needed is built into your solutions. Okay, so from an AP automation perspective, these are some specific items that we'll be covering today. And some of you may be familiar with these. Some of these solutions may be utilized in your organization currently. But I think you'll find, regardless, there's some new information here, recent developments that we've had that may prove to be worthwhile, even with that solution that may be in place. So we'll start off with intelligent capture for AP. And basically, most oftentimes, our partners are linking that with their AP invoice approval workflow. So a capture method to pull in all of the necessary data from any AP invoice that enters the organization, and then route that directly to the workflow for handling. We'll also take a look at new vendor account approvals. Another item that we create for these processes is an electronic form, what we call a Unity form, that folks can fill out and submit that and have a workflow on the back end. So in this example, maybe a buyer fills out that new vendor account form, hit submit, and it goes back to the office for someone to review and ultimately determine if that vendor will be approved to be a supplier. In a similar manner, I mentioned earlier, certificate of insurance renewal, creating a workflow around this process as well, where instead of one person potentially handling this process, instead of that being siloed with an individual, having that process have greater visibility, right? And ultimately put a lot of automation in, instead of having to reach out to vendors to get an updated certificate and then having to wait for that or maybe not get it. We can build a certificate of insurance renewal workflow that will handle a lot of that for you. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And lastly here, reporting dashboards, a relatively new tool. A lot of folks are familiar with report services. Report dashboards is an updated version of report services that has much greater functionality, and we'll see a few examples of that as well. So to start, we'll cover the intelligent capture for AP. For short, we call that ICAP. So what this is a way for invoices that come into the organization to be captured and ultimately sent to the workflow for review and approval. Intelligent capture utilizes optical character recognition, or OCR for short, for the most part. And ultimately, it is reading the entire invoice during that capture process. There are no zones, there are no templates. So unstructured forms is what the system relies on to pull all of the necessary data. What is this going to do for your team? It's clearly going to reduce data entry, right? So today, with indexing documents, folks are adding keyword values to get those stored appropriately and linked to other documents. That piece of the equation will be eliminated with intelligent capture, because again, the system is pulling all of the values off of the invoice and placing them in the keyword values automatically. Along with that, of course, it's going to improve that indexing accuracy, making sure that there's no errors from keying in values. And then ultimately, really what the ultimate goal is overall is to speed up that invoice payment process, to be able to get these invoices from probably your email inbox into the review process as quickly as possible. So let's break it down a little bit in terms of how the intelligent capture system works. So I just talked about optical character recognition and how great it is to extract that data from the invoice. Well, this first step doesn't utilize that at all. So the first thing we're looking at here is how the system recognizes the vendor. Well, again, this is where we capitalize on that direct integration with agility, because the system is going to see this invoice, and it's going to be looking for a phone number, a remit to address, and or a website. So a combination of those factors. Once it locates those on the invoice, the system is reaching out to agility and saying, I have these criteria. Tell me which vendor matches these criteria in agility. Once that match takes place in a matter of seconds, that vendor data is then pulled back into intelligent capture and added as keyword values here, like we see on the document on the left-hand side here. Beyond that is when we really start to see the magic of intelligent capture. So the one thing about what we're looking for here is 4 fields specifically at a minimum, which will allow us then to have that voucher created in agility once the invoice is approved. So we need these fields to be pulled from the invoice: the number, the date, the amount, and the PO number. So as you see here, the system is able to recognize where that information is located on the invoice and add it as a keyword value here on the left-hand side. It's done that for the most part, we see with this example, and it will actually tell you where it's pulling that information from. Now, there are some scenarios where you're going to find maybe it wasn't able to pull a keyword value for some reason. Well, this is the first invoice that the system has seen from this vendor. So it's trying to figure out where the information is. Obviously, every vendor has a different layout for their invoices, but that's the beautiful thing about intelligent capture, and what makes it so robust is the fact that you can teach it over time and it will learn, where then in the future, when it sees the same invoices, the same vendor's invoices, it will be able to automatically recognize where the information is because you have already taught it. Now, these, of course, are meant to be the exception and not the rule, but it is just another feature to show you can instantly teach intelligent capture where some information is. So we use this one as an example. We see the customer PO number header information is really not that close to the actual PO number. So the system had a difficult time being 100% confident where the information was. Well, what we're able to do as we're validating this information here is what we call point and click indexing. So once we locate where that PO number is, all we simply need to do is double click on it. And the first thing it'll do is add that value automatically to the PO number field. But then after that is when the system then remembers, okay, for Milliken Millwork invoices, moving forward, I know where the customer PO number is located. So then you've taught it and you will not have to do that again in the future. So again, a very robust solution that we've had a lot of partners utilize in conjunction with their AP invoice approval workflow. So if there's any folks that are on right now and maybe you are utilizing an invoice approval workflow, this is one thing that really I would consider looking into and maybe speaking with our team more about to see if it can work for you. So moving on, speaking about workflow in general and how that can apply to any of your AP processes. Again, we've already talked about this, right? Creating a standard framework for any process. Get that consistency in place where folks are following the process that you have outlined, that we have built for you. And so there's no variation or deviance there. Of course, a big part of it is automation and automating those business decisions. Are there steps that are being taken today that really aren't necessary when you think about it? You know, kind of sparking some ideas there about what might be able to change. Again, utilizing those APIs as part of that automation as well, that's only going to help with the efficiency and the removal of manual effort. And again, we'll talk through a few of these examples. And then providing notification, of course, when actions are needed to be taken within any of these processes, making sure that they're not forgotten about, right? That the folks that are involved are aware and reminded when there's something that they need to do. And of course, as we said with the common theme, ultimately providing that transparency and oversight, especially from C-level, where folks can get in if they need to and see exactly what's going on in real time within any of these processes, and then take action as necessary. So we'll start off with again, our most common workflow that we build for folks, and that is the AP invoice approval. And right now we'll focus on the PO invoices. So as I mentioned earlier, AP Recon, what you're going to be able to do with this workflow is have these invoices be automatically approved. We'll dive into this here in just a moment a little bit more, so you can gain a better understanding of just exactly how robust this tool is. And of course, again, there's always going to be exceptions. Your team will be able to manage those through the workflow as well, based on the logic we put in place. And then routing invoices for approval as necessary, whether that's automatically based on different factors like branch or approver or branch manager, but also manually too if necessary. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit because I think you'll be very excited. I hope you are, just like I am, about what these workflows can accomplish from an AP Recon perspective. So what's going to happen is, and we'll utilize ICAP on the front end as an example, once that invoice is recognized through intelligent capture, it will enter the workflow automatically. There will be some other checks on the front end in terms of just making sure it's not a duplicate. But then it's going to hit what is the biggest piece of the process. And it's going to go through a series of AP recon checks. And so first of all, what it's going to do, the workflow is going to look at that invoice amount. It's going to reach out to Agility and say, I have this invoice amount. Is the invoice amount greater than the AP recon balance that exists within Agility? If that invoice amount is greater, that invoice fails and will then be routed to someone to review and make sure the appropriate adjustments are made, obviously, before that invoice is approved. If it passes that check, the next check is going to ask, okay, is this invoice amount equal to a receiving line in the AP recon or within the variance that's allowed? If it passes that check, the invoice is going to be auto-approved. And what that means is nobody is going to have to review that invoice. And then with that voucher creation API I mentioned, the voucher will be created automatically in Agility, and the invoice will be set up for payment as well. So you think back to some of that manual work, right, with the data entry and how folks are needing to enter that information into Agility. Well, we remove that step as well, because once that invoice goes through the workflow, all of that necessary data is being exported over to Agility for the payment to be set up. So no one is having to worry about that data entry step. Coming back to our AP recon checks. So step number 2, let's say it fails that check. Well, the final check it's going to do is to see if the invoice amount is equal to the overall recon balance or within the variance. Again, if it passes that check, the voucher is created and the payment is set up in Agility. Now, I mentioned within the variance on those second checks there, and that is because what we typically do, again, based on your organization's requirements, we'll build logic into the workflow to account for a variance, right? So if you, let's just use as an example, let's say you have a $500,000 invoice that comes through. And typically your variance check is, okay, well, if the invoice amount is within 1% of the receiving line or the total AP recon balance, we just want it to be auto-approved. We don't want someone to have to mess with that. It's not worth the time or effort to go back and change it. Just move it on. Okay, great. We can do that. But when we get to those bigger invoices like $500,000, 1% being $5,000, well, at least to me, that's a lot of money. I think it is to a lot of folks. So there's basically a fail-safe that we also build in on the back end where we can say, okay, if the variance is within 1% or up to a maximum amount, then it can be approved. Otherwise, it needs to be reviewed. So you could say 1% of an invoice with a maximum amount of $200. Well, if it fails either of those variances, then again, it's going to route and need to be reviewed and approved by someone. So in those scenarios, if an invoice cannot be auto-approved, what's going to happen is a note, like you see here on the right-hand side, is going to be placed on that invoice automatically, and it will route based on logic to who needs to review that and make the proper adjustments, whether that's the branch manager, the buyer, maybe there's someone on the AP team who takes care of those exceptions and then sends them back to the proper person for approval. Whatever the case may be, that's the process that will take place. Outside of that, of course, I mentioned you're going to be able to handle these exceptions. If the invoice is a duplicate, it'll flag that to make sure an invoice isn't getting paid twice. It's also going to check to see whether or not the PO within Agility has been canceled. Of course, not wanting to pay invoices for canceled POs. And then ultimately, you'll decide what you want to do with those, whether that's just to remove those from the workflow or have someone actually review them to make sure that is accurate. We have a lot of our partners too who want to make sure that direct POs, invoices related to direct POs are handled through the workflow. So we certainly do that as well, and then can route those on as necessary. And then ultimately, one of the biggest things to really think about is from an approval standpoint, right? The goal ultimately is for a lot of the invoices to match AP Recon, and then no approvals necessary. They route through the workflow, approved automatically, and the voucher's created in Agility. In those scenarios where someone does have to approve an invoice, what does that look like today? How would you like it to look? And certainly we can mimic what your approval process is today within a workflow. But the other factor to consider, and what we oftentimes do, is consult with you to determine, okay, you want to put a workflow in place. Well, should we talk about if some adjustments should be made, right? Instead of just mimicking the approval process that's in place today, are there steps that can be taken to make that more efficient, avoid any delays, and certainly make sure that you're able to take advantage of your discounts as well? And you'll see here one of the things that's often considered, and I try to put myself in the shoes of a CFO. If I were a CFO and there was a huge invoice that came through, I certainly would want to be able to see that, right? And whether it's coming to a queue that is for me and I can actually look at that, or I at least have oversight where maybe there's a flag that recognizes if an invoice is over a certain amount, then I know I can go in and take a look at it and make sure that it's taken care of properly and that it should actually be paid. So we've talked about the PO-based side here, but really quickly, the same workflow would also be handling these non-PO invoices. So expenses, things like that. Oftentimes we know most of those invoices need to be reviewed by somebody, whether that's a branch manager or otherwise. So just briefly, the workflow will handle these as well. Clearly managing exceptions, just like the PO side. And then routing those invoices similarly based on logic, right? Who needs to take a look at those? Who's assigned to the vendor in Agility? Well, we're going to pass those invoices on to that individual for review. And then the other nice feature is a GL coding form that exists with each invoice in the workflow. So basically, if there are default GL coding values that are associated with the vendor record in Agility, we're going to pull those over and apply those automatically. But then what folks are able to do is view that GL coding form side by side with the invoice, and if necessary, make adjustments to the GL coding, whether that's splitting amongst multiple GL codes, whatever the case may be, to make sure that that is set and accurate before they approve it. And then, of course, all of that information being sent over to Agility. So again, we come back to one of our central themes, right? Oversight of any process and management. And one of the main things that we always want to consider is, yes, we want to help you put a workflow in place, and that's great, but it also has to be manageable. We don't want to create some sort of a monster that the folks who are in charge of it, we don't want to create more work for them, right? So there's a couple of tools that are included with any workflow that will assist with that. And one of those I mentioned earlier, email notifications. So you see here on the right-hand side, we have the ability to set up email notifications. So in the event that an invoice comes through the workflow and fails, like we see here, fails the AP Recon, we can have an email notification sent to the individual who is in charge of approving that invoice. And that email will include not only a copy of the invoice attached, but also a link so they can get into the workflow directly to review that documentation and ultimately review and approve that invoice. And I'll show you an example of this in the demo portion. The other tool here that can be considered are timers. And this kind of revolves around emails as well. except this is more from a reminder standpoint. So, let's say you've got an individual who needs to approve invoices. They have their own workflow queue, and they're stacking up in this queue for whatever reason. We can set up a customized schedule to send email reminders to these folks to say, hey, you've got one invoice in your workflow queue. Please review and approve as soon as possible. And again, it's customizable. So this is something where we can send these email reminders once a day. For example, say 8 a.m. If there's an invoice in someone's queue, they get an email at 8 a.m. that says you have at least one invoice to approve in your workflow queue. Or it could be based on basically a daily reminder, right? So every 24 hours, so to speak, from the time that an invoice hits their queue, they're going to get a reminder that says there's an invoice that needs to be reviewed. We can take it one step further even and say, for example, after 2 email reminders are sent to that approver and that invoice or invoices are still in the queue, we're now going to also send a reminder to their manager to let them know that these many invoices are sitting in this approver's queue, again, just as another level of oversight and transparency into the process. So again, that's completely up to you and how you would want that to work, and fully customizable based on your requirements. And then, of course, the timers can also be utilized to route invoices as necessary, again, if they are getting stale or not moving for some reason. So to continue with the oversight aspect, reporting is huge. So I mentioned the report dashboards are the newest tool that folks are utilizing. And it's certainly an upgrade from report services, and it's certainly more dynamic in terms of what you can do. One of the biggest benefits is the fact that when you open up a report dashboard like we see here, it's a real-time view of what is going on. So of course, we've got this dashboard that's associated with a workflow. The one thing to keep in mind with report dashboards in general is they can be created based on any data that's within Agility or documents that are stored with WorldView. Report dashboards are not only associated with workflow processes. So for example, a lot of folks ask us to build a report dashboard based on our POD reconciliation process. So they want a comparison of their AR invoices that are created within Agility with the PODs that have been scanned and stored with WorldView. And so any AR invoice that doesn't have an associated POD, it's going to pull up on this report to show you, hey, this branch needs to be scanning in their PODs more consistently because a lot of them are missing. So that's just another example outside of workflow. But to come back and kind of focus on what we've talked about so far. So again, you're going to have that full transparency with these report dashboards over what's going on in the workflow at any given time. The data, of course, is exportable if you need to send this to anybody. And then you'll actually be able to view any of the invoices that maybe are pending here. You can view them as well simply by double-clicking on the line here. So reporting, of course, is just another management tool that can be utilized in conjunction with the workflow or any other process really that you have within your organization. So another offering from WorldView from an AP perspective that has been very beneficial for our partners are Unity forms. And I know we're focused on AP today, but again, this is one of those tools and resources that can really be utilized for any process. But for today's sake, we'll kind of focus on the AP side. But these are forms that can be utilized internally or externally. They don't necessarily just have to exist within the organization. If there's something that you want your customers or vendors to submit, we can always create this form and make it available to them in some manner, whether that's on your website or otherwise. A lot of you are probably familiar, of course, with autofill keyword sets from indexing documents in general. We can also apply these to these forms based on the situation. So again, auto-filling different values and not having to manually key those in. And then from a logic perspective, kind of on a related note, you know, it's not just the fact that you have these fields here and someone needs to type in all of their information. We can create drop-down menus so folks can select options. We can make keyword values required, so people have to fill them out before they submit them. Just a surefire way to make sure that you're getting all of the data you need at once. And you know, other things like that that we can always talk through to make sure that the form is capturing exactly what you need, and again, creating efficiency within those processes. So ultimately, yes, those are some of the benefits, right? We're shortening the process. We're ultimately saving time, just as we want to do with any of these solutions, capturing all of that data up front and just improving the user experience overall. Just as an example, internally at WorldView, of course, we utilize OnBase. And we have forms that look basically exactly like this for internal processes. So our time off requests, expense reimbursement requests. We utilize these forms and have a very simple workflow on the back end where our finance team will review those once we submit them. And then we get a notification once that's been approved or if more information is needed. So we're certainly not only offering these, but we're also a client, so to speak, of these Unity forms and the workflow processes. So from an AP perspective, just to touch on a process with the new vendor account form, we'll see an example of this as well as part of the demo. But this is basically exactly what it would look like. And then what folks will also have the ability to do is add any attachments that might be necessary or, you know, would make it a little more proactive in terms of the review process. So we'll talk about that in depth, a little more in depth here shortly. And then from a workflow perspective, once that form is filled out, submitted, behind the scenes, it'll route to the appropriate individual for review and approval. And then what we can also do, again, with the integration with Agility is send that information over to make sure that that vendor is then set up appropriately. And then, of course, being able to set up those notifications as well, where whoever submitted the form initially, they'll be notified of whether the vendor's been approved or ultimately denied or rejected. So lastly, from an example standpoint, I mentioned certificate of insurance renewals. This has been a relatively new process that's come to us from a few of our partners looking for a way to just manage that process better. We have one partner they have one individual who is in charge of renewing the certificates of insurance, reaching out to the vendors to get updates. And then those forms are just placed into a folder on their network and no one else ever sees them. So really no one else knows whether they're actually being updated, you know, how many are past expiration date, things like that. So again, we're looking at processes, right, that provide greater oversight, but we're also looking at how to make it simplified, right? Instead of having to always email or call these vendors to get a renewal on the certificate. So basically, like you see here, we're going to be able to proactively notify those vendors and provide them with a form, basically to upload the renewal. They can attach that updated certificate and then submit it. And then once they do that, it'll automatically return to the workflow. And then that document with the updated expiration date is stored. And then basically, once that expiration date rolls around again, or 30 days out, what we're doing is then sending an email automatically to the vendor and saying, okay, we're 30 days out from expiration of your certificate. Please provide us a new one as soon as possible. And then they have this form available and they submit it. So basically, it's a hands-off process at that point where folks can go in and see and make sure that the certificates of insurance that are in the workflow are up to date and valid. But really that process should be managing itself, and has been doing that so far with the recent customer that we've put it in place for. All right, so now we get into the fun part. Okay, so we're going to walk through a few examples here of some of the items that we've discussed so far. And so this email may look familiar. It was on one of our slides where an invoice failed the AP recon process within the workflow. So myself as the approver, I received this email, and so I know I need to go out and take care of this. Well, again, we can just utilize our link here within the email. It's going to pull up the workflow for us automatically. And we see the invoice right here in front of us. Now, the nice thing about this is any supporting documentation that is linked to this invoice is going to be available directly within the workflow as well. So you see here, we have the invoice, but we also have the purchase order available. So we can actually view that document side by side and find out where the discrepancies are and ultimately what needs to be changed. What we're seeing right now is our web client. So a lot of you might be familiar with the web client. This is very beneficial for end users, just like this scenario, right? So they can pull it up quickly. They can take a look at everything. If they need to jump into Agility to make changes to the purchase order, they can do that. And then ultimately, it's as easy as reprocessing this invoice, because then once those adjustments are made in Agility, they click the reprocess button. This invoice is going to go back to the start of the workflow, go through those AP recon checks, those 3 checks again, to make sure that everything is accurate. And then at that point, of course, it would be auto-approved and set up for payment. So we're going to do that. We're going to say we made our adjustments. We're ready to reprocess this. So once we click that button, then the invoice will disappear from our workflow queue, and it will go back through that workflow process again. So we're going to jump over now to our Unity client. So we saw the workflow just now in the web client, right? The online version. And this is the Unity client. So this is a tool that's really designed more for the AP team, so to speak, right? So they would have this installed on their desktop. This has a lot more functionality than the web client. So things that the AP team likely would need to be able to do their job throughout the day. We're right here on the home page or the personal page, whichever you want to call it. And the nice thing about this is each individual user can design this personal page the way that they want to make it work for them. So my personal page here is set up with a bunch of different tiles, excuse me, that represent a few different items. So for example, these are workflow queues that I can access, or I have permissions to access. And we see lists of invoices that are sitting there, lists of invoices sitting there waiting to be approved. Well, if it's my time of the day to start reviewing invoices. I've got a break. I can take care of some of these. I can just click on one and ultimately just open it up right from here instead of clicking through anywhere up here. We also have even basic retrieval searches you can set and customize, where once you click on it, it's already going to have the specific document type, and then you just simply need to put in a keyword value to complete your search. And then forms as well. So really anything that exists that a user has permissions to access, they're going to be able to really customize their Unity client and make it work for them. So let's jump back into the workflow now that we're in the Unity client and specifically focus on the export queue. So these are the invoices that passed the recon and have been sent to Agility with the voucher automatically created. So we see the note that's put on there automatically, and all of this is getting ready to be sent. And we see that that invoice that we just reprocessed in the web client is now here. It's past the AP recon, we're set, we're good to go. So again, this provides that level of oversight, right? So not everyone necessarily needs to have access to this queue, but those proper individuals who are having oversight over the process, they may want to jump in and see, okay, what invoices, out of all the invoices in the workflow, what's the percentage of those that have been that have passed AP Recon and have been approved automatically? They're going to be able to see that here at any given time. So similarly, from an oversight perspective, the reporting dashboards are available within the Unity client as well. So as I mentioned, these are very dynamic and a real-time view of what's going on. So what we see right now is representative of what's in our demo workflow. And the nice thing is that you can filter. You can have information laid out like this. You can have graphs if you like graphs. It's fully customizable. But let's just say we want to see the criteria or the details of what's in the approval queue in the workflow, what's waiting to be approved. Well, if we click on that in the tile, the rest of the tiles are going to change and show us that. So it looks like we've got 3 invoices awaiting approval. And then like this graph breaks it down by branch. So it looks like Omaha has one and Lincoln has a couple as well. And again, you can export this data very easily, but we can also clear those filters. And let's just say, okay, we want to see everything in the workflow for the Omaha branch. Okay, so it looks like, well, we've got 1 invoice pending approval, but we've also got some direct POs, some invoices for direct POs that are in there as well. So again, this is really just the goal of this, of course, is to provide that transparency, that full oversight of what's going on in the workflow at any given point in time. So the last thing that I'll show you really quickly here is that new vendor form. So again, I've set my personal page where I can pull that up right away. Now, for example, let's say you've got a buyer and they're out making purchases from a new vendor that hasn't been set up yet. Well, what they can do is pull this form up and maybe they're on their laptop, maybe they're on a mobile device, which is another item that we certainly offer. They can pull up this form, they can fill it out with all of the supplier information. Again, attach documents if they have those available, and simply submit that for review internally. So a very quick process, and what they might even find is as they're still speaking with this vendor, they may even receive the approval for them to be a new supplier while they're speaking with them, right? That's how quick the process can be with that simple workflow on the back end. So just an example there. But those are just a few items, again, that I wanted to show that are just basic examples of how we can assist with automating your AP processes. That concludes what I am going to speak about today. But certainly what I would do is encourage you, if you're interested in any of the items we discussed today, or if you're interested in just speaking about ideas in general and what else we might be able to do for your organization, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I'll leave my contact information up here on the screen. But also, you can always reach out to your account manager directly and they will get me involved, and we can certainly start those discussions. So with that being said, I certainly hope you find this presentation to be beneficial. We will have a recording to send out, so you can provide that to other members of your team. And I certainly hope to speak with all of you very soon. Have a great afternoon and take care.